We are going to talk more about first person and third person today. So, how can we tell who is telling the story? That's our question, and that's the question we are going to answer today. Okay, let's start with the very basics. What is a narrator? A narrator is the person who is telling you the story. There are two types of narrators: a first person narrator, which is the main character, will tell you his or her story, or there's third person. Third person is when the story is told by an outside narrator or someone who is not in the story. Okay? We'll have some practice with this, so don't fret if you don't understand. First person is when the main character will use words such as I or me to tell you his or her story. So if I was telling you a story about myself, I would say, I went to the grocery store to get myself some food for dinner. Okay, I just told that story in first person point of view. Okay, let's look at this example. When I arrived at school, I went straight down to the cafeteria to say hello to all of my friends. I knew they would be waiting to hear my story about what happened yesterday after school. We know this is a first person narrator because they're talking about themselves. They're using words such as I to tell a story about themselves and what they did. Okay? Third person point of view is when the narrator will tell a story using words like he or she to refer to the main character. So, for example, if I'll use the same example. If I was going to the grocery store and my daughter was telling you, she would say, she went to the grocery store to get herself groceries to cook for dinner. Okay, let's look at this example of Tom. Tom walked straight down to the cafeteria as soon as he got to school. He was excited to share with his friends how he had scored the winning goal in the soccer game last night. So the narrator is not telling this story. It's an outside person telling this story. Tom is not telling the story. Someone else is telling this story for Tom. Okay, we know that because it's not using I or me. It's using words like he and Tom's actual name. Okay, let's move on. In today's lesson, we will learn how to identify who is telling the story, and we will learn how to identify a first person and third person narrator. Okay? Who is the narrator? We're going to read a story together, and after we have read it once together, we're going to look back at it and find who is telling the story and how do we know. Okay, so pay attention. All right, this story is called A Dog's Tale. A Dog's Tale. My father was a Saint Bernard, and my mother was a collie. This is what my mother told me. When I was well grown, I was sold and taken away, and I never saw my mother again. We said our farewells, which means goodbye, and looked our last upon each other through our tears. The last thing she said, keeping it for the last to make me remember it better, I think, was, in memory of me, when there is a time of danger to another, do not think of yourself. Think of your mother. Do as she would do. Okay, so we've read this story. Now we need to think of who is telling the story. What kind of clue words are they using to help us know who is telling the story? Okay. So this is what I've just asked you. Who is telling the story? How do I know? What words are they using to let me know who's telling the story? And is it a first or third person narrator? Let's read it one more time together before we discuss. Okay? Read along with me as I read the story. A Dog's Tale. My father was a Saint Bernard, and my mother was a collie. This is what my mother told me. When I was well grown, I was sold and taken away, and I never saw my mother again. We said our farewells and looked our last upon each other through our tears. The last thing she said, keeping it for the last to make me remember it better, I think, was, "In memory of me, when there is a time of danger to another, do not think of yourself. Think of your mother. Do as she would do." Okay, so we've read this story a second time. What words do you notice in this story that they use over and over again? Think about it for a second. Look back at the story. Fantastic job. You're right. They use words such as my and I. So what do those words tell us? Who is telling the story? Is it the person inside the story telling it, or is there an outside person telling the story? What do you think? Yeah, the dog is actually telling the story about himself. It's an inside person telling the story. So would we think that of as first person narrator or third person narrator? What do you think? Great job. This story is told by a first person narrator because it uses the words I and my. A dog is telling the story because it tells us that it has a St. Bernard for a father and a Collie for a mother. These are dog breeds. The dog also tells us about him being sold. So this story is told in first person point of view. Okay? All right, now you're going to go practice identifying first person and third person narrators yourself. Good luck.